Green Springs National Historic Landmark District is, as its title suggests, a unique resource. National Historic Landmarks, by definition, make unique contributions. There are some 70,000 historic properties in this nation that can claim coveted status by being listed on the National Register of Historic Places. But only 3,000 have attained the level of being designated National Historic Landmarks. Those reach that level in part because of their integrity, specifically the survival of those qualities that make them bridges to the past. An advisory committee to Congress judged Green Springs to be a unique assemblage of rural architecture, and as a result, Green Springs takes its place as a National Historic Landmark beside such treasures as Mount Vernon, Monticello, the Alamo, the Smithsonian Castle, and the White House.
So much of what Green Springs is just the resources are so interesting, but it's not just the resources, it's how that's woven into that community. The stories that are out there, the human stories that are out there are so significant. I think that's probably the untold gem of what the district really is. Are all of those personal stories, the sacrifices, the ebbs and flows of wealth and issues and problems, and really what happened in Green Springs over history. It certainly captures so much of our nation's history, the settlement all the way through the Civil War, the period after the Civil War. It's such a great vehicle to tell all of those stories. When I carried folks around for different tours or for informational purposes was showing them around, I always made sure that I caught folks, whether it was at West End, or I would take them to Ionia, or I would take them to Boswell's Tavern, take them to Hawkwood, and not only just to see the structures, but to talk to those landowners. There's such pride in so many of those people and the property that they own and the history that they really feel, many of them feel like they are today's stewards, and they're trying so hard to make sure that that their work is carried on in the future. So there's so much passion, there's so much interest, and that was just one of those things that I just really enjoyed working in Green Springs.
It's something that I have learned to appreciate more and really treasure, the foresight that the folks had that that really committed the base acreage to starting the district, because it's easy to look 20 years down the road, and it might not be that long, but since development has slowed here recently with the economic situation, maybe it'll take a little bit longer. But I mean, if you look at some of the long-range planning maps of like a Thomas Jefferson planning district, the only green spot left in like a 5-county area is Green Springs, and that's kind of scary.
The big issue that brought the community together up here was the potential of building a high-security prison here in Louisa County, and I'd say from here, it's, as the crow flies, maybe no more than 2 miles, and it was a massive thing right in the middle of old homes with large acreage. It would have been a nightmare.
A large portion of the state penitentiary was going to be relocated to an area 2.5 miles north of Zion's Crossroads on Route 15. Well, my heart stopped beating, I think, and certainly my jaw dropped, as did my husband's, and we realized that our home was 2.5 miles north of Zion's Crossroads on Route 15. So from that moment, and of course it's a moment none of us who heard that news broadcast will ever forget, we got together at the local elementary school. There were speeches that I imagine rivaled those that took place during the Revolutionary War. Great declarations were made that we would fight this thing till we died, that we weren't going to have a maximum security prison in our neighborhood. We, of course, found that the facility was going to be across the road from our farm, and not, in fact, on our farm. But that was the beginning of a 4-year, very hotly contested confrontation between the people of Green Springs and the Commonwealth of Virginia, which of course extended eventually to the federal government because we learned that the federal government was going to be funding the facility.
My recollection is of Colonel Ely calling Angus to tell him what was going on and that there would be a meeting of the neighborhood. So the ladies were very meek and mild, and the colonel took charge along with Elizabeth Knowlting. And at that point, of course, our Henry Taylor lived in Richmond, so it was his parents, Isabel and Henry, who were involved. And there was much concern about what would happen to the neighborhood if this thing came. I remember later Angus saying, no, that isn't the way to look at this. The way to look at this is that this is a special area that should not be adulterated by such a foreign object being placed in the middle of it. And what we could do is prove how unusual this area was. So at that point, we got the Department of Historic Resources already had been working on several projects. They had Boswell's Tavern on the National Register, so they were beginning to look at these properties and realize they were a little unusual. And Hawkwood was discovered by Angus and by Freddie Nichols and Jane Davis, who came down from Columbia, that this was an Alexander Jackson Davis house. This was the missing house. So all of these events came together. We were able to use a lot of expertise that might not have been tappable otherwise. So time went by, and it was decided mainly by the menfolk that counsel should be hired, and they hired Emanuel Imrock to pursue this in court.
It's such an example of what Virginia especially was going through at the different periods in time, what crops were important, the movement across Virginia in its earlier stages, how that agricultural base and that economy drove what that community became. It drove its architecture, and that's something else I think that is so significant about Green Springs, is that it certainly isn't cookie cutter.
What offended me personally was that with all the scrub cut over pine land in Virginia, where you had potential for good water supplies, why foul the nest with? And I have nothing against prisons. I think those people do a good job, and penologists do the best they can to lock up and or reform people. But, such a gorgeous piece of land and so key to that area.
In those days, the prevailing wisdom and sentiment, not only in Virginia, but I think everywhere, was that you can't fight City Hall. That was what you heard from everybody. There was no such thing as citizen activism. The first thing that happened was that we tried to get some more information about this and found that the facility was going to be a really massive facility called a diagnostic and reception center. It was going to be maximum security. It was going to be lit 24 hours a day. It was going to be 2 football fields by 3 football fields in size, and just really going to be a mammoth facility.
Well, they wanted to build a diagnostic center on a 200-acre land across from Green Springs Plantation. That would have brought in a lot of jobs, and people needed jobs here. No question about it. The times were pretty tough.
The work they did and being followed around on the country roads, being frightened. Eunice also told me those stories. Mrs. Fisher told me those stories of being frightened, being followed, not knowing if someone was going to do you harm. Of course, there's a large feminist component to this, and I think people like Eunice and my daughter's mother-in-law and others, I think this was really one of the first times to step out, and I think that also was a threat to them. I think it would have been different had this all been all men opposing. advocating preservation. I think it made it harder for the opponents when it was mostly women.
People feel that it's their right to stand up and object to it, but that was certainly not the norm at the time. Even some of the elected officials in Washington were sort of taken aback when we would go to Washington and ask them to intercede for us. They were just shocked. And I remember one senator saying, well, I don't know why you came to see me. There's nothing I can do. Even though he was a United States senator and this was a federal project, he was just couldn't imagine why anybody would come to see him. When historic Green Springs began its protest, people found it really shocking, and we were roundly criticized, particularly by the people of Louisa County, as being just totally out of order. And particularly, I was just roundly condemned for speaking up. I was taunted, and I've had lots of death threats, and I was really abused by officials from the Louisa Sheriff's Office. We've had a lot of incidents where we were really put in fear by some of the officials. But it was unheard of for for a community to make the fuss that we did. And there were lots of editorial letters to the editor condemning us, and it was a very, very bad time. There was just a lot of fear on the part of the community here about the noise we were making.
A good part of the courthouse crowd wanted it, and the people go somewhere and drink a bunch of beer, and they would cuss us out, these old fogies over here in the Green Springs, and just it was this end of the county against the rest of the county. I mean the rest of the county. But at any rate, the neighborhood was organized, and I do remember going to two things that I actively, my father did really a lot to help it.
When the prison was in the works, the neighborhood bonded together, and they really were very constructive and forward-thinking, probably visionaries, all of these people, in planning a neighborhood action. Grassroots, we'd call it. Well, it's very desirable if you're against something or for it. That was just the beginning of this Green Springs neighborhood. And then I think the Green Springs, the historic Green Springs, grew out of that.
My job and Ray Ely's job, we were the public awareness program. And I went about, I remember with a babe on a hip, showing reporters from Richmond and from Charlottesville. And we did special tours, we had everybody organized. The Gallaghers over at Prospect Hill were very, very effective and very open to allowing us their house, as many others. We did the tours, we beat the drum, and developed a lot of publicity, at which Ray is extremely good.
Man, people came to those tours, 10,000 people. And see, nobody ever done this before. And I said, let's have the tours in the fall. The Virginia garden tours are in spring, so let's do ours in the fall. Jeez, you've never seen anything like it.
Then that worked up into an historic district, and of course Ray Ely was living here, and she did a heck of a lot of good things in those days and got things accomplished.
There were no models that I was aware of in the country that we could use, and so it seemed like we needed to devise something that could conserve 14,000 acres. So we applied for and received a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts to do a land use study. And we brought in one of the great landscape designers of his day, Mr. Meade Palmer, and he did what became a prototype study and defined the area in Green Springs that should be preserved.
The historic district, in my opinion, and easements are a wonderful thing for this community. The more I think about it, the better I like it, because just sitting here, I can look all around and say, nobody can make a mess out of this, because we have this easement, and it's with the Division of Historic Resources, State of Virginia, and they're easy people to work with, and they know what I'm doing, and I keep them informed, and I do what my easement papers say, and I recommend it to anybody.
The Brenneman studies wanted to analyze, can an area be protected solely through easements and not through land ownership? And Brenneman concluded that they could be protected, that an area could be protected through easements. And I would say that if you look at the 14,000 acres or the area under easement, I would say that it has done that. But it has been a rough go. And it has been, it has really taken a lot of effort on the part of the landowners.
The Green Springs Historic District is 14,000 acres. And if we had been in a very remote area, we would have felt, I think, more secure. But we're not in a remote area. We're just a few miles from Charlottesville. We're not that far from Richmond or Fredericksburg. And we are unfortunately situated right at the crossroads of I-64 and Route 15. Green Springs has been in continuous agricultural use for over 300 years. And our goal has been to make sure that it continues in agricultural use. The farms are very large, and the visibility on these farms is unbroken. You can see for miles here. If you start breaking up these farms, you lose the viability for the farms being economically useful. In the very midst of the most intense part of the fight to stop the prison in Green Springs, actually in October of 1972, the county administrator, a man by the name of Dean Agee, ran into me one day and said, I don't know why you continue to fight the prison so hard when the whole area down there is going to be strip mined. A few days later, there were headlines in the paper that the W.R. Grace Company, which was at that time in October of 1972, the 43rd largest multinational corporation in the world. And it turned out that they had been scouting Green Springs for a very long time. In fact, it turned out they'd had Green Springs in their sights for at least since the 50s, since the late 50s, but had never really actively pursued it.
Well, of course, the vermiculite mining leaves a tremendous scar on the land, and it also completely despoils the wonderful soil quality of the area. Once it's disturbed and churned up, then there's no way to reclaim it. The only way to do any kind of reclaiming would to actually bring in new soil.
Deposits that they had in Libby, Montana, they were having trouble there because of the contamination with asbestos. October 1972 marked the beginning of the tremendous effort to prevent the Grace Company from beginning what they said would be 80 years of strip mining in Green Springs. Historic Green Springs bought 10 shares of W.R. Grace stock at $10 a share. And I bought 10 shares also. And that enabled me to go every year to their shareholders meeting. And I would stand up and I would talk to Mr. Grace. I was in the audience, but he was there on the stage, and I would tell him that the company was doing a terrible thing. And at the same time, we were fighting Grace in the courts and before the Board of Supervisors. We were doing everything possible to prevent them from getting a toehold.
People wanted to mine the vermiculite on that property, and the associations, Green Springs Association, didn't want them to do it. And they fought them, and they had right to fight. Marie managed to get 3 of the supervisors in her corner, which was John Q. Butler, Jimmy Last, and James King. And then there was, of course, Earl Alton, Carson Winston, and I on the other side. And almost every time we voted, it was a tie vote. But that didn't make a lot of difference. But they were all for the mining until all at once, bingo, they switched over.
What we see with respect to the vermiculite mine, of course, when there was any, I mean, you can't believe that although they turned on me, was a friend of the hunters and that kind of crowd, probably a little redneck myself, but I'll tell you, when the vermiculite mining thing would come up, regardless of what it was, they were at my doorstep, and they were mad. You don't want those people mad at you, because we can be pretty mean and ugly. And so I think the women were generally afraid. I think they were unusually courageous, because every one of them knew the culture they were in. I mean, they weren't ignorant of the culture they were in.
After 20 years, the battle began in October of 1972, and in 1992, spring of 1992, I believe it was, I met with Peter Grace. He was quite elderly at that time. Grace had indicated it was going out of the vermiculite business, and I said, why don't you just give it to Historic Green Springs and take a tax deduction? At that time, they owned about 1,300 acres of land in Green Springs, and Mr. Grace, I'll never forget, said, well, that seemed like a good way to end this thing.
See, W.R. Grace was so involved in it, and W.R. Grace gave all that property to the Historic Green Springs, and people raised hell about it.
There was another company that came in on their heels that was also negotiating with some of the landowners in Green Springs for the rights to either buy or lease their properties. And one of those was called Virginia Vermiculite Incorporated, and that was headed by a man by the name of Robert Sansom. And they were successful in getting a lease on only one property.
We received the deeds to the Grace land in 2 different batches. When the announcement happened, as I recall, representation from Virginia Vermiculite showed up at Ray's office and said, we understand that you have been given this property and we want to speak to you about mining the property. She was like, well, you know, Green Springs operates through a board of directors, and I will discuss it with them, but I think it's highly unlikely that this would happen. We took a vote and we said, no, we're not mining the property. And Bob Sanson said, well, then I will sue you in antitrust court.
During my 7 years as project manager, the most controversial as well as the most consequential was the vermiculite mine lawsuit, which of course went on for years.
Federal lawsuit from Virginia Vermiculite, which was suing both W.R. Grace and Historic Green Springs for federal antitrust, for basically monopolizing the mineral vermiculite and conspiring somehow to put Virginia Vermiculite out of business by keeping this resource from them.
From what I've seen, I was not allowed to have a whole lot of viewing of the Virginia Vermiculite mining operation, but I did see enough to see that it was more of a moonscape than it was anything else, and it was really quite disturbing.
The night before the trial started, W.R. Grace settled, and settling meant that all of their fancy New York attorneys in sharkskin suits and their Pullman cars full of resources got back up and left Charlottesville for New York, and we were standing there by ourselves.
In the antitrust case, we had Charles Montaigne, who came in from Seattle, one of the most brilliant lawyers anyone will ever know, who handled the antitrust case for us at a discounted rate throughout, and Professor Charles Getz, one of the leading economists and antitrust experts, who testified as our expert, never charged us a penny, just an amazing person.
We got out fairly quickly, and it took us, almost 9 years. When the war is over, the sun comes up, the battlefield's bloody and nasty, and that's kind of what it was. But we did live to fight another day, live to fight other battles, and that's empowering. At the end of the lengthy antitrust battle, historic Green Springs was exonerated of any wrongdoing.
The challenges to the district are significant and numerous, both internally and externally. And a lot of my conversations with Parks Service managers, both at the park and the regional and even the Washington level, I always talked about these internal and external threats to the district. The internal threats can be the landowners that you're there to work with. I think we saw that in the Eastern View case, where we had a fairly extreme example of where we had a mission to perform. We had kind of a pact with that community that the Park Service would be a willing partner to help protect the historic nature and character of that district. And that internal threat came in the form of the desire to significantly alter a historic structure, and just our general authority was even challenged in that confrontation.
This residential development at Zion Crossroads of 1,200 homes plus commercial is going to put a drain on our infrastructures, particularly water and sewer, and because there's no river running close by of any kind, and the emphasis right now is to get water from wells, that's groundwater, and there's a limit to those kind of things. I mean, people think there's no limit to this. There's a lot of horror stories that have come up over the years about people running out of water.
The external threats, I think, are those that are even more of a challenge to manage with the growth of Zion's Crossroads and just that whole central Virginian area. The pressure on development, and we see it in national parks all over the east and even out west, where what was once pastoral farmland is now becoming neighborhoods, developments. And I would just, looking at the way that particularly Louisa County there is developing, and in Zion's Crossroads, I would just think that if it weren't for these easements in place, Zion's Crossroads would have long ago worked its way into the district, and it would be high-density neighborhoods, industrial parks, commercial areas, just like much of the rest of Route 15 is through there. That open agricultural landscape is going to be so critical as time progresses. The idea of what open space is and what agricultural land is the rest of Central Virginia, particularly along that interstate corridor, is developed. Residential areas and commercial areas and industrial areas gobble up that farmland. What you drive down Route 15 or Green Springs or any of those roads, that feel that you get driving through that rural landscape is becoming more and more scarce. And so I think that that's one of those resources that maybe has been taken for granted, particularly early on, but I think it's will be one of the resources that as time progresses will become more and more valuable.
Despite the battles to prevent the prison complex, struggles against strip mining for vermiculite, challenges to the easements and the landmark status that have resulted in legal validation of both, development pressures that threaten the district's natural resources, numerous legal battles, including an antitrust trial. Despite all of this, the people of Green Springs continue to give easements to ensure the area is preserved in perpetuity for all of America.